Thanks very much, Fred, and thanks everyone for turning out this morning. Want to start just by acknowledging my co-author Shashank Mahan and our research assistant Jason Self, who did human work over the past month in helping me put together this study. And thanks, Fred, for the introduction. I'm going to keep my remarks fairly brief so we can get to the panel discussion. The more detailed results of the study you can find in the study in your packet, and happy to discuss any of that in the Q&A. The impetus for this report came from a series of conversations I had with my grandmother this spring as gas prices were going towards $4 a gallon. My family lives in Wyoming, and Wyoming is a state where folks are relatively savvy about energy. We mine just under half of the country's coal. My grandmother can see gas rigs at her porch. But as she saw gas prices go up and was watching the press and listening to politicians from both sides of the aisle offer panacea solutions to high gas prices and energy security challenges, she was left fairly confused as to how to put these things in context. What's the appropriate balance between increased domestic production and improved efficiency and alternatives? What can these individual policies do in terms of changing the country's energy trajectory? How much could they do in combination? And so what we tried to do with this study is take leading energy proposals on the table right now, throw them against the wall and see just how far they could actually get the country, both individually and collectively, and talk about some of the implications of that. So to start with just a little bit of context, this is the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and so we look at this issue primarily through an economic lens. And energy is a factor of production, like labor and capital and land, and like other factors of production, increases in the costs that aren't offset by improvements of efficiency create drag on economic growth. Now, the good news is, over the past 100 years, the American economy has gotten much more energy efficient, and that's the chart on the left right there. The bad news is that improvement in efficiency hasn't been enough to offset increasing energy expenses. So we spend more on energy as a share of GDP today than we did in 1900 or than we did in 1950. And energy prices, oil prices in particular, are quite volatile, and so those big spikes that you see, the history of which everyone in this room is familiar with, exact some fairly significant damage on the economy. The oil industry was born in the US, and we remain the world's third largest oil producer, but that hasn't been enough, of course, to keep up with rising US demand. And so we now import better than half of our oil resources. That's contributed more to the growth in the US trade deficit over the past decade than total trade with China. About 43% of the US trade deficit in 2008 was net imports of oil expenditures. So when oil prices rise, you see a significant deterioration in America's terms of trade. So the amount of imports that we can buy with our exports declines. And of course, that increased dependency on foreign oil comes with a host of national security consequences, which we discuss in the brief. So the good news is that after a couple decades of rising dependency on foreign oil, the U.S. going forward is projected to become considerably less dependent on foreign oil as a result of both market forces and past policy. So this chart shows forecasts out to 2025, and the deltas are the change between where we would be if we hadn't had any improvement in vehicle efficiency, no increase in domestic oil and gas production, no expansion of biofuels, and where we're likely to be now, which is the top of that light gray bar. So increases in domestic production, the past CAFE rules, increases in domestic natural gas, the renewable fuel standard, other market forces get us about 2/3 of the way towards the goal that President Obama announced in March of reducing U.S. oil imports, net imports, by 33% by 2025. But we've still got about 1.8 million barrels a day left to go. And there's some room for additional upside surprise in domestic oil production, given what's taking place in unconventional oil production in North Dakota and other parts of the country, which is the chart on the left. And not just U.S. production, but other Western Hemisphere production, significant increases in production in the next 5 years are forecast for Canada, for Brazil. And so the IEA, in its most recent estimate, projects that the Western Hemisphere will add more oil capacity over the next 5 years than OPEC will, in large part because of capacity coming offline in Libya. So that's the good news. The bad news is that the long-term picture still looks relatively rough. Over the long term, most additional oil production is going to come from OPEC countries, and most additional oil demand is going to come from developing countries. The combination of those two factors is likely to deliver high and volatile oil prices for years to come, which brings us to the current policy debate of what can the U.S. do through additional policy to help reduce our economic vulnerability to oil price disruptions and some of the attendant national security consequences. And there's no shortage of policy options on the table. And so what we decided to do is take a selective group of some of the lead policy proposals, broken down into those that would increase domestic production, those that would improve energy efficiency, and those that would advance fuel substitutes, whether biofuels or natural gas or electric vehicles. So we looked at everything from accelerating leasing and permitting in the Gulf of Mexico to expanded offshore access to the proposed light-duty vehicle standards, to advanced biofuels development and electric vehicles deployment. We also examined the impact of a carbon tax, which is not traditionally thought of as an energy security proposal per se, but has recently gotten some new life in political debate as a result of the country's fiscal situation. 4 of the 6 institutes that participated in the Peterson Foundations, not to be confused with the Peterson Institute's Fiscal Solutions Summit, advocated carbon tax for deficit reduction purposes. So we also looked at AEI's carbon tax proposal, which is a $26 per ton carbon tax in 2017, escalating at 5% a year, to see what that would do relative to some of the other energy security policies that we assessed. And we looked at the results using a variety of metrics, so change in U.S. oil production, change in U.S. oil demand, change in oil prices, et cetera. On the supply side, accelerated leasing and permitting in the Gulf of Mexico would deliver some meaningful gains over the next 3-4 years, up to 300,000 barrels a day of additional U.S. production. Over the longer term, expanded access to offshore production could deliver anywhere between 300,000 and 700,000 barrels a day in the out years. These charts are showing the annual average between 2011 and 2035. On the demand side, the most high-impact policy is clearly the LDV standards, the light-duty vehicle standards for 2017 through 2025 that are currently being considered by the administration. We looked at a range, because we don't know what the standards are going to be specifically, a range between a 3% annual increase in vehicle efficiency and a 6% annual increase in vehicle efficiency, which is the range that the administration has indicated they're exploring. And even at the low end of the range, that's still the highest impact policy on the table in terms of reducing oil demand. The surprise to us coming off of this is that a carbon tax was the only policy that did well on both counts, both increasing domestic production and decreasing domestic demand. The increase in domestic production comes primarily from 2 sources. The first is a carbon tax prompts a switch in power generation from coal to natural gas, increasing domestic natural gas production. When you produce natural gas, you don't just get gas, but you get things called natural gas liquids, which can be substituted for crude oil in the manufacture of some chemical and heating products. On the demand side, you get much broader reductions in oil demand, not just from passenger vehicles, but from industry, et cetera, which is kind of surprising to us. So supply side, demand side policies have a different impact, of course, in on which side of the lever they pull. They both improve U.S. trade balance. They both reduce the amount of oil that we import. They have a different impact on the vulnerability of the U.S. economy to oil price spikes. So policies that increase oil production reduce the price impact of any given oil market disruption by making, on aggregate, the global oil pool a little bit less risky, right? So if the U.S. accounts for 15% of global oil production instead of 10%, let's say, then the relative weight of riskier producers is reduced. So if you get some of that supply taken offline, it's going to maybe deliver a $5 price increase instead of a $7 price increase. The downside is that increased domestic production reduces oil prices, increases demand for oil, so the net change in U.S. oil expenditures is relatively low, which means that any change in oil prices has the same impact on the US economy as it would before the policy. Again, kind of surprise to us coming out of this bit of the analysis was how well a carbon tax scored. Of course, the downside of a carbon tax is on this energy expenditures chart on the left, where a carbon tax, in addition to increasing it decreases expenditures on oil, but does so through a tax, which if that tax is not refunded directly to energy consumers, significantly raises energy expenditures. Of course, it can be refunded to energy consumers if that's the way that the policy is designed. And then we used one other metric to score the different policies that we looked at, and that's an index developed by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in 2010 called the Index of Energy Security Risk. And Chamber did a very good job of putting forward a kind of clear quantitative metric that could be used to assess policy's impact on U.S. energy security. And so that shows you kind of the history of U.S. Energy Security Risk Index. It's off a 1980 base. So if the numbers decline, the U.S. is more energy secure. If the numbers increase, the U.S. is less energy secure. And we got kind of two findings looking at that, which is the chart on the right. The first is that kind of surprisingly, because a carbon tax both increases domestic production and decreases domestic demand, it scored kind of heads and shoulders above the other proposals that we analyzed in terms of its energy security impact. But the other finding was that any of these individual policies don't really do much to bend the curve. We're talking about 1 to 2% change in the U.S. Energy Security Risk Index. So then we looked at, well, what would happen if you threw all of them together? If you did everything on the table, how far would that get the U.S. in terms of reduced oil imports? And it's significant. We have a base case and a high case. The differences between those are discussed in the brief. And if you combine supply side, demand side, and substitution policies, you can get up to a 3 to 4 million barrel a day reduction in net U.S. oil imports, which is fairly significant. The policies have different impacts on different time frames. Increased domestic production is particularly important in the next few years when the forecast for international oil markets is particularly tight. In the long term, you're going to get much higher impact from the efficiency and fuel substitution policies than from the supply side policies. But even if you take all those policies together, you still do not fundamentally change the nature of our challenge, which is a reliance on international oil markets that are volatile. It'll improve U.S. terms of trade. At the margin, it'll make the economy less vulnerable to oil price spikes. But domestic oil prices will continue to be set by events that are happening outside the U.S. For the next couple of decades. And so where we end the report is, with an observation that what's perhaps most important is what's almost entirely missing from the current policy debate, which is a strategy for reducing the vulnerability, reducing the volatility of international oil markets. And we offer a series of recommendations in the report, and I'm not going to go through all those now. I want to highlight one and then close, which is the importance of better information about how oil markets function and better forecasting about oil demand, which will allow markets to more successfully plan for future capacity to meet future demand. And on that score, unfortunately, policy recently has kind of moved in the wrong direction. The most critical information point in the energy market is data put out by the Energy Information Administration, which is an agency that operates on a relatively shoestring budget and an agency that got its budget trimmed by 14% in fiscal year 2011. So for a meager $15 million in budget savings, we lose things like analysis of the role of financial markets on oil prices, long-term forecasting, international energy statistics. There's a kind of laundry list of EIA services that are going to have to be trimmed back. Just to put those $15 million into context a little bit, that's significantly less than 1 day's government spending on energy. So if we turned off the lights for an extra day in federal buildings, we'd save 3 times as much as we just carved out from the EIA. It's 0.01%. It's significantly less than the price savings that you would get in the American economy from a 0.01% reduction in oil prices compared to the hourly U.S. oil expenditures. and finally, unused and non-refunded DoD airline tickets in 2009 is $100 million. So, there are lots of cheap and simple things that we can do to make oil markets more reliable going forward, and maybe starting with the low-hanging fruit makes sense in addition to pursuing a kind of all-of-the-above strategy. So thanks. Happy to discuss more of the findings in detail in the Q&A.